which is basically a week to explore international themes and celebrate different cultures. My name is Nellie Khalil. I'm the director of the Office of International Education here at Harper. I'm also a biology faculty member, and we have a wonderful group of faculty today that are going to share our lovely experience in Kenya and Uganda that took place over the summer. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues.
All right, my name is Mukila Maita from the Geography Department.
My name is Bethany Statler, and I'm also in the biology department.
And I'm Joseph Fingermeyer, and I'm in the biology department. All right. Okay, so today we'll talk about the program that we all experienced in East Africa this past summer, and then we'll talk about the topics that you see there listed. So this past summer, 14 of us went to East Africa, 14 teachers and educators. So there were 12 community college faculty, and then 8 community college faculty and 4 K-12 teachers. And this program was funded by the US Department of Education through the Fulbright-Hays program. The program was led by Richard Johnson and myself. So you see us there. We spent 45 days in Kenya and then 2 weeks in Uganda. We're mostly based at a university in Kenya called Kenyatta University. So the program, so there you can see a map of Kenya and Uganda, East Africa, and there on the map you can see the places where we visited. We didn't go throughout the region, but we were mostly around central Kenya, the coastal region by the Indian Ocean, and then southern Uganda.
Yeah, so there are a couple of reasons why we chose to visit Africa. A couple of fun facts. Africa is the second largest continent in the world by landmass. It is also the second largest continent in the world based on population. So a fifth of the world's population, 20% of the population lives in Africa. But a lot of the people in the US don't know much about Africa, right? Unless you have family or you have descended from Africa, there aren't a lot of opportunities to learn about Africa in the US. If you think about maybe how much did the continent come up in like your high school or middle school education. And so without education or any connections to Africa through either family or friends, many people's first impressions of Africa come through the media. So this is a clip from UNICEF. It's an infomercial that had the purpose of trying to solicit donations to feed starving children. And so these clips were recorded in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's one country in the entire continent of Africa. So if someone grows up with no other exposure to Africa and only sees these clips through the media, then they might develop this misconception that these clips represent all of Africa when that's not the case, right? These were only clips recorded in one section of one country within the entire continent of Africa. And so the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right here, here's a map, right, of all of the continent of Africa. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is just one country in the whole continent, one of 54 countries that exist in Africa. And so the same way that a clip recorded in Venezuela doesn't represent all of South America, a clip recorded in a part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo does not represent all of Africa. So Africa is not homogeneous, meaning that not all parts of it are the same. People living in Western Africa likely speak a different language than those living in Eastern Africa. Those in Southern Africa might appear different or have different traditions than those living in Northern Africa. So even the info that we share today, are representative of the Eastern African region and Kenya and Uganda, and also don't represent all of the entire continent, right, of Africa. So I want to bust a couple myths about Africa, such as there's only one main African language. No, right? That is totally incorrect. This map I found kind of tries to place languages, the most common language spoken in a few different regions of Africa. Even within a single country, multiple languages are spoken. In Kenya and Uganda, which we visited, at least for Kenya, the two main languages, official languages, are Swahili and English. So we did get to learn a little Swahili, and that was fun to use and speak with Kenyan people. And there are also some regional languages that people speak, such as Kikuyu, Kamba, Luo, and there's a whole bunch more that couldn't fit on this list. So a lot of people speak a lot of different languages in the different regions of Africa. Here's another myth. It's all wild animals and with little development. Not true. We definitely saw wild animals, but we also, in our downtime, we went to malls. Okay, this is a little gif of a mall that I passed. I went shopping. I'm wearing some of the garments that I bought in Kenya. We ate at some great restaurants, similar to the restaurants that you would find in the US. And we also stayed in hotels that were comparable to hotels in the US. We stayed at a lot of different places that ranged from like campsite-like grounds to hotels, but it did range definitely from camps to 5-star hotel range. And then one last myth about Africa: it's hot and dry and sunny all the time. I'll be honest, I thought it was going to be smoldering hot all the time. I packed for a very hot and warm climate because Kenya it's on the equator, so I was thinking, okay, like most of the sun is hitting this part of the earth, so it's probably going to be pretty hot. There are certainly warm parts of the country, but we were also up in the mountains, and it was actually very cold. So that is why I had to buy this to keep myself warm. We went on some hikes. We are wearing coats. We are bundled up. There are definitely cold parts of Kenya, and so that is why we had to bundle up. And I think you are now going to talk about the different geography of Kenya.
Yes. So I will discuss the geography of the continent, but before doing that, a little bit of, couldn't hesitate as a geographer, a little bit of political geography. So Kenya, in popular discourse, is part of a region of the world referred to as sub-Saharan Africa. But the term sub-Saharan should keep in mind that this has an origin in an earlier term called Black Africa or Negro Africa that came during the time of slavery and colonialism. But after that, sub was added to it. Now, there are critical scholars of African politics and culture, as well as activists, who call the term sub-Saharan as racist. And I do belong to that group. So you don't call British subarctic, for instance. Now, in terms of the physical geography, this is a satellite image showing Kenya and Uganda. You notice that there's a lot of brown. So what does that brown indicate? Just shout it out. Desert, yes. So you have deserts. You also have semi-deserts. You have areas that you see some green there. So you have different types of vegetation zones. So Kenya is unique. And if you add Uganda, both of them are unique in that you have a range of climates from tundra and snow and ice. So you saw from the earlier, from the Professor Stadler showing the image from Mount Kenya, we were up at about 11,000 feet above sea level, and that was tundra. So what you'd experience in northern Canada is what we experience in Kenya. So the highest mountains are 17,000, the highest is 17,000 feet above sea level. And there you have snow and ice. And then as you go down in elevation, you enter areas with tropical rainforest, monsoon forest, then you have savannas, you have scrubland, and then you have also deserts in the extreme north. So this part of Africa Kenya going into Ethiopia and Somalia, you do have deserts, and some of the deserts are the classic deserts with sand dunes and the like. You then, so the next slides I'll go through and explain more about this geography and why it's important. So if we'll look at Kenya and then Uganda. So this, what you see on the left-hand side, so you see two maps of Kenya. On the left-hand side, it's a map. This is called a digital elevation model. So it shows you elevation. So the white parts are the highest areas with the highest elevation. And then there's green up as you move into browns, and then green, and then light green, you're going lower in elevation. So the areas that have high elevation, that's where you have better rainfall. And so most of the agricultural areas are in the areas that have higher elevation. And so that ends up impacting land cover as well as livelihoods. So in areas where you have savanna and arid regions, you find that that's where you find livestock being kept and you have ranching and that kind of thing. Then where you have better rainfall, then you have agriculture, different types of agriculture. And the most intense are where you've got very good rainfall. So we did get a chance to experience a large number of these climates there. And then along the coast, there is the Indian Ocean. So that's a marine, tropical marine climate there. And so the map on the right shows land cover. So this dark brown, that is barren. So that is where you find classic sandy and rocky deserts. And then the central part of the country is where you'd find forests and a lot of green, dense green vegetation. So I grew up in Nairobi, Kenya, and the elevation there is about 6,000 feet above sea level. Temperatures are mild throughout the year. So coming to the US, that was extreme. Both summer is too hot and winter is too cold. So Kenya, the temperature, Nairobi, that city, the temperatures range between 70 and 80. And 80 is only 2 months of the year, it goes into the 80s. Otherwise, it's in the 70s. Nights are always in the 50s. So very, very pleasant. Uganda, this is a similar map. So you see on the left-hand side, digital terrain model showing that you have higher elevation in the southern part of the country and the eastern part along the Kenya border. And then that also ends up impacting vegetation zones and also livelihood. So in Uganda, pastoralism, that is keeping livestock and ranching and that kind of activity is found in the northern part. And then the southern part of Uganda, south of this lake I'm pointing to, that's where you find most of the agriculture. Uganda gets a lot more, the rainfall is much more reliable in Uganda than it is in Kenya. So Uganda is considered a breadbasket for East Africa. So even Uganda, if some of you if you've read it in history, in the 70s and 80s, they had a lot of turmoil and civil war there. There was never a problem with food. So hunger, despite war is terrible, but even though there was war and fighting, there was never a problem with hunger because of the way the country is endowed. Now there is a significant geological feature that passes through both Kenya and Uganda. It's known as the East African Rift Valley or the Great Rift Valley. This is a section where the Earth, if you've studied plate tectonics, you know that the Earth is made up of plates, large sections of crust that move. So the eastern part of Africa is splitting. And in several million years, the eastern part will be an island. That split starts in the Red Sea and extends all the way to southeastern Africa. And in Kenya, it's the most dramatic. So that's a picture that was taken during our trip. And within the Rift Valley, you do have lots of different interesting features, like this lake that we visited that has flamingos, and you can see volcanic mountain behind it. The East African, this map shows the east extent of the Rift Valley. So up from the Red Sea through Ethiopia, the Ethiopian highlands, and then into Kenya. So what you see labeled as the Ethiopian dome and the Kenyan dome, you have a plume of magma that is rising from the mantle that creates that that has uplifted the crust there. And then you have the two branches, the Western Rift Valley through the western part of Uganda, and then you have the Kenyan one. It's not as dramatic in Uganda as it is in Kenya. But this area is significant because this is where hominids and humans evolved. So without the formation of the Rift Valley created climates that caused our early ancestors to start the path to evolution to become humans. And East Africa is the home for all human beings. So this is the area of the world where we originated. Now, when it comes to fossil sites for early hominids, most of them are concentrated on the eastern part of Africa, and that is where you have the Rift Valley. And there are some in southern Africa, but it's thought that the original evolution was in Eastern Africa. So there's one famous anthropologist who said that the science is clear that all humans are one species originated in Africa, but he said that politics is not yet there. But eventually, we will all recognize that we're all human beings from the same place. The Rift Valley also is well endowed in terms of natural resources. So we got to experience during our trip geothermal power. So the generating electricity from using the heat that's stored underneath the ground to heat water and drive turbines and the like. So Kenya is the fifth largest geothermal producer in the world. So we got an opportunity to visit a geothermal production area, and we got a behind the scenes tour from some of the engineers. And although I'm from Kenya, but I know that this kind of thing is, it was really a unique opportunity. Not everybody gets to have that kind of experience. And we were very close to the turbines. The video file was too big to upload, but it was really loud, and we went very close to these production wells. In terms of, so you might ask, why do we have these climates that I discussed in? So this is a climatic map that shows a lot of variation within Kenya, and more in Kenya, less in Uganda. So part of it is topography, meaning the mountains, the Rift Valley, that influences the flow of wind. But the other factor is the intertropical convergence zone. So let's see, okay, that slide is hidden. But anyway, so if you look at wind circulation around the Earth, around the equator, you have winds that converge from the north and south. And when they converge along the equator, their winds rise. Now, the winds are also impacted by the changing position of the overhead rays of the sun. So the zone of where the northern and southern winds, which are known as trade winds, converge, it's a belt that moves north and south with the seasons. So as it moves through the continent of Africa, during one part of the year, during the northern hemisphere summer, it will move to the north. During the southern hemisphere summer, it will move to the south. And this drives the rainfall that is experienced in Kenya and Uganda. So there are two rainy seasons. One that is from March, around late March to early June, and then the other one towards the end of the year. And it's tied to this movement of winds. So if you take my physical geography class, we'll talk more about those winds. All right, so some pictures of from showing you those different environments. So you see the mountains where you did see us bundled up on Mount Kenya. So I did climb it in 1989 to the third highest peak there. This was still up on the mountains, but now we're entering the forest zone, equatorial forest zone. This is tea plantation in a climate that would be called equatorial, tropical rainforest environment. So very good rainfall. Then this is this picture is at about 9,000 feet above sea level. The next picture is at about 2,000 feet above sea level. You can see that the vegetation has changed. So scrub with some grass and so on. And then this is the Masai Mara savanna area, about 3,000 feet above sea level. And then that is by the ocean, the Indian Ocean. The country has got major, so it's not all pretty, like as you see here. The country has both countries, Kenya and Uganda, have major environmental challenges. So you can see landslides. So those do occur in areas that have steep elevation and disturbed slopes. You do have a lot of erosion because of the denudation of forest and ground cover. Some of I'd mentioned, you had seen from the earlier satellite image that the area was arid, so you have a lot of seasonal rivers. But you have the issue of sand mining on those rivers. So sand is dredged for use in the construction industry, but then it creates problems where the water cannot infiltrate the ground and you have flash flooding. Right now, because of we're in the El Nino season, El Nino phenomenon is happening around the world, and for East Africa, it means excessive rain. So if you look at the news today for Kenya, there's a lot of flooding. So you see an image of flooding. And then where there are forests, we have issues with cutting down trees. We also have lots of issues with pollution. All the cities have problems with waste disposal. Then also some of that waste gets into waterways. And the problem is that the waterways are used by people for washing, for getting drinking water, and livestock drinking it. Then you have these hazy skies over Kampala. So we experienced this live because we went to Kampala in the dry season, and a number of us got sick because of the severe air pollution problems. There are challenges for both countries, so they're very unequal in terms of the social economic situation of the population. So you do have picture on the left-hand side shows a street vendor. So lots of people just survive by informal commerce, and the very bottom in terms of society, in terms of protections and just financial stability, and also do get very vulnerable. And then on the right-hand side, you have a professional in an office that could be here in the United States. So you have those extremes. And in terms of also how people live, you have very nice suburban places that if you took off your blinders, you could say you are in the US. And the most wealthiest, you're in Barrington or somewhere. But you also have the slums too, at the far extreme, and all that is in between. So both countries, the challenge of inequality is not just in the US, it's a worldwide problem, and we got to experience that. I think you'll hear some of that as it applies to conservation.
Yeah, so one of the things that our group investigated when we were in Kenya and Uganda were different conservation approaches. So I want to ask, when you hear the word conservation, what do you think? What does conservation mean? I know some of you are in Bio 103, yes. Preserving something, and what does that preservation usually involve? If you're trying to preserve or conserve organisms. Okay, so it can include restoration, where you try to bring back some of the native species. What else does preservation usually involve? We do it a lot here in the US with our national parks. Yes. You maintain the natural state of the ecosystem. Yes, conservation approaches include that. Let me ask you this. Have any of you gone to a nature preserve where they close off the boundaries so that you can only visit, but nobody lives in that nature preserve? Many of you have seen places like that. Yes? All right. So that is one major conservation strategy. It's something called fortress conservation, and it's based on the idea that humans are destructive to the environment. And so with fortress style conservation, the idea is that if you exclude humans from the environment will be protected in some sort of way. We saw this a lot in Kenya and Uganda. I will actually tell you the history of fortress style conservation started here in the US in the early 20th century with Theodore Roosevelt. A lot of our national park systems were developed as a fortress style conservation approach, where again, we excluded people from those areas to protect the land. Let me ask you, here in the US, who did we exclude? Who did we end up removing from the land in order to protect those spaces? I know you thought you would talk about Africa, but we can bring it to the US too. Yeah. Native Americans. So back when the national parks here in the US were established, Native Americans were forcibly displaced from many of those national parks. We see the same thing in Kenya and Uganda, and actually in several African countries. So fortress-style conservation often includes excluding local people from the area. It also includes enforcement in some capacity, so that enforcement can include fines if people extract resources from that area. It could include fences to keep people out. I will also say it could be even worse than that. In some places, you might have armed guards that protect a piece of land that have been told that they can shoot at people who might try to extract resources. And typically in these protected areas, there are certain activities that are deemed appropriate, like tourism or safari hunting from tourists or scientific research, but other types of activities, particularly activities of the indigenous people that used to live in those spaces, are not deemed appropriate, right? And again, they're excluded from the land. So let me give you some examples of places that we visited in both Kenya and Uganda that use this kind of fortress style conservation approach. So I put pictures instead of words. I wasn't sure the best way to approach this, but I have 3 different locations on this slide. 2 of them are national parks. One is a national reserve. The pictures on the far left, this is from Nairobi National Park. It was the first national park established in Kenya. Let me give you the year. It was in 1946 that it was established, and it was established when the British were still a colonial power in Kenya. Nairobi National Park today sits in the middle of Nairobi, which is a very big cosmopolitan city. It's kind of like if Chicago had a huge national park in the middle of Chicago. In order to maintain it as a park, there are a number of fences put up. Those fences also are put up as a way to control what we would call human-wildlife conflict, because if you have a national park in an area that's very densely populated, you might have instances of animals trying to move to the edge of the park where humans might have activities that include things like food that animals might be in search of. So there are issues with Nairobi National Park in terms of that human-wildlife conflict. So there's a lot of enforcement to try to, again, keep people out from the boundary to ensure that the animals don't kind of interact with them. There was one other thing I wanted to mention. It is a big draw for tourists. So one of the other things about Nairobi National Park, it's not free to get in. You do have to pay to get in. So there is also somewhat of a reinforcement of this national park being a big draw for tourists, but not necessarily being a big draw for local populations that might live in the area and might also want to learn about their natural ecosystems. Here in the middle, this is Queen Elizabeth National Park, which is in Uganda. Queen Elizabeth, when it was first established, it was determined that there were 11 communities in Queen Elizabeth that could remain living in the national park. Those communities largely depended upon pastoralism. Professor Maitha mentioned pastoralism earlier. Pastoralism is a way of life where you have livestock and your livestock could graze land. So often it involves you moving around as your livestock is grazing. So some of those communities still utilize grazing. Some of those communities utilize fishing. The issue, however, with Queen Elizabeth National Park is that what we're starting to see is that what were historically grasslands are increasingly being converted into shrub, which are not good food sources for a lot of the wildlife. The human populations who currently live in the park, their numbers are increasing, and so their utilization of the resources are increasing. I'll also say there have been some studies done on some of the animal populations. We talked to a scientist who researches lions, and he was looking at the decline in lion populations in the park. And because of this decline in some of the wildlife, there has been a push by the Ugandan Wildlife Authority to actually remove and expel the 11 communities that currently live in the park. So, you know, as I know you guys are taking biology classes and you're thinking about conservation, and conservation's great, but another thing you need to wrestle with is how do we do conservation if it also involves a human rights issue, right? If we're displacing people from land, how would you feel if somebody suddenly told you, hey, you know what, you can't live where you live anymore because we want to protect this for wildlife, right? Our third example here, this is the Masai Mara National Reserve. This was established in 1961. Initially, it started out as a pretty small reserve, but then it expanded in size. And again, the expansion involved displacing people and moving them to the margins of the reserve. Some of the land in the reserve have been given back to some Maasai tribes in the region, but there's still a big, huge swath of land that's managed as a reserve. And for the Maasai communities that we talked with, the removal of them from these lands was a huge issue because there is a tie between their way of life, their livelihood, and the land. And again, a lot of our Maasai people that we worked with or talked with, they're pastoralists. So once you remove them from the land, they have to find other means of surviving besides relying on livestock raising. So that's one example of fortress-style conservation, but I will tell you, we also saw some privately owned reserves, which also use this model. So privately owned reserves would be like people who own the land, who kind of exclude it from other folks. Which one do I want to start with? I'm going to start on the far right here. This one really bothered me. We visited a woman. She's quite wealthy, and she actually has some land that she has made as a permaculture farm where she grows things like crops and she grows animals for consumption. She also has bought land that she wanted to conserve some of the wildlife. And her goal was to connect that land to Nairobi National Park so the animals could migrate from the park to her. One of the things she mentioned when we went to go visit her, though, is that she mentioned that she had some squatters living on her land and had talked about how she was going to take them to court and sue them to try to get them removed from the land. And again, this, I think we all kind of, our eyes opened a little bit to kind of see the way that she was talking about these, what she called squatters, which may have been people who actually had historic ties to the land. In the middle, you're seeing Soya Sambu Conservancy. This conservancy was established by the Lord Delamere family. A huge history of colonialism tied with them. Currently, the Soya Sambu Conservancy, they do have a portion that they use for livestock production. But again, a lot of it has involved excluding local populations from the use of the land. And then on the far left here, you're seeing some images of a botanic garden. So we did visit a botanic garden that was beautiful. Another way to conserve biodiversity. However, most of the plants that we saw in this botanic garden were not native or indigenous to Kenya. So they were brought in, wonderful, beautiful specimens, but they were not necessarily the native plant population. So the question remains like, well, if we're working on conservation, shouldn't we be working on conservation of indigenous plant communities instead of something that's not native? Okay. So, with that being said, oh, the picture's not so great, but these are pictures that I took at all sorts of locations that use this fortress-style conservation model. Can you tell me what's missing from these pictures? It's a very difficult question. There's a big thing that's missing, a big part of ecosystems that is missing from these pictures. Well, trees, there are trees in Soya Sambu here. That kind of ties to the physical geography and the climate, whether you have trees or grassland. That's a good guess. Yes. There is some variation plants. You guys are picking up on things that I didn't consider. There is some variation plants that I didn't necessarily include in these pictures. And again, a lot of that variation you'd see would tie to the climate and the physical geography. Yes.
Predators?
Predators? You know what? There are predators there. They're a little hard to spot, but we did see things like lions. We did see leopards, predators in the area. Yes. There is water. I needed more pictures, apparently. Yes. Say it again. Green would tie to like the rainy season. If you look in the middle picture there is some green, so it depends on when the rains come, how green things would be. I'll maybe point to, okay, people. Yes, people is what's missing. All right. Sorry, that's the point we're trying to get home, is that people are missing from these landscapes. So when we talk about conservation, right, for a conservation approach to really be effective, it has to include people. It has to include the local populations. So as an alternative to fortress-style conservation, we also visited places, that use what we call community-based conservation. So community-based conservation doesn't rely on this idea that we have to exclude people to conserve areas. It relies on this idea that in order to conserve areas, we have to involve the local population, and that culture is tied to nature, that you can't separate nature from people's culture. Oftentimes, community-based conservation will involve kind of collaborations between people who live in the area, indigenous knowledge of the plants and animals that live in the area, and working with the scientific community in terms of modern scientific knowledge as well. Okay. So again, it's a little different than that fortress-style conservation because this does not assume that nature is separate from people or nature is separate from culture. So here are some examples of community-based conservation areas that we visited. One was the Aveti Community Forest Association. So this was a local community that was responsible for maintaining and protecting the forest in which they lived. Their villages were like on the margins of the forest. The community association, they would allow some resource use of the forest. In particular, if there were things like downed trees or branches, people could use those to make things or to burn. We happened to pass somebody who had made a chair from some of the downed wood material in the area. That's one other thing I wanted to mention about Aveti, but they did allow some resource use by the people living in the area, but again, with the goal of conservation. A lot of their management plans came from the Kenya Wildlife Service, so there is still kind of this issue of the Kenya Wildlife Service is this big national agency that is still providing kind of the guidelines for how to manage the area. There's a little bit of that conflict between what the national organization wants and what the local community might want from the area. The two pictures on the right are from Seed Savers Kenya. This was also a community-based organization, and their way of protecting biodiversity is by teaching farmers and teaching local populations to conserve and save seeds, particularly seeds of native indigenous plants. So not plants that were brought in by the British colonial powers, but plants that are actually indigenous and native to the area. They also work a lot with farmers in terms of sustainable farming practices, and they work with women specifically and have a number of women empowerment programs as well. Because women in that region particularly were the ones doing a lot of the seed saving. Another community-based organization or community-based conservation strategy or group that we visited was the National Eye Conservancy. The National Eye Conservancy is the first community-owned conservancy in Kenya. It was established in 2016. And again, their goal is to manage the land but not exclude the community. We visited a college there, which you're seeing up there at the top. The college largely is training students to be able to continue to work in the region. A lot of their training is focused on the tourism industry, and I think my colleague Joseph is going to talk a little bit more about tourism, so I'll hold off on that. We also visited Karura Forest, which was a forest in the middle of a pretty affluent area in Kenya. But again, the goal is conservation, but still having people use the area for recreation. Right? So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Joseph. 10, yeah. 10.
So I think the major tourism industry in Africa and East Africa is what people call safari. Preferred term is game drive. Safari elicits feelings of colonialism from British occupation. So we went on game drives, and they were both amazing and, for me personally, quite complicated. So Spencer, our driver, was amazing. I think most of us really loved our drivers and bonded. We were with them sometimes every day for seemed like weeks. And the vehicles were amazing for the terrain. And we were able to drive through prairie land, savanna land, and see animals that I had only ever dreamed of seeing. For example, the elephants in this picture, the clouds are so lovely. It's just an amazing landscape to be on. So grazers enjoying the grassland. This supports the predators that live on the land, the ones that everybody gets excited to see, the big cats like lions. And then this is a sunrise on our first game drive at Lake Elementaita. So the landscape is amazing, and being able to go see that was a powerful and wonderful experience. However, the game drives have both positive and negative impacts. So positive is we get to see these beautiful landscapes, which were wonderful, and we get to see these animals up close in their natural habitat. So the giraffe and the zebra. But how am I getting this picture? I took this picture leaning out the window. I almost could have touched the zebra. So how am I able to get this picture so close? And the answer is because we're driving right up on them, these animals. You can actually see other vehicles in the background here. And you can even see that the zebra, you can see the hair is moved on the neck. It's trying to get away from us in this photo. The positive, in addition to my enjoyment of that experience, is that it supports a massive tourism industry. According to Reuters, in 2022, it was expected that there would be $2.13 billion infused into the local economies. That's just Kenya. So that's a huge boon. And then people like Spencer, our driver, one of our drivers, makes his life that way, right? So he depends on us coming in and doing these activities. And then that money gets distributed throughout Kenya. So the tourism industry is good for Kenya in that way. Here's a picture of us on a boat, and we're driving, well, somebody's driving the boat along the shoreline, and we get to again see Africa. So this is a different game drive kind of, it's not a drive on a car, but similar kind of experience. These opportunities are everywhere in Kenya, and the market depends on them in some areas. So we were in the Masai Mara, and in the Masai Mara, there's hotels, there are tour guides, travel guides, drivers, and then the people who are selling gifts along the roadside, waiting for the tourists to come through, or gifts or other items. But as they bring in all this money, it's also bringing in a lot of people and a lot of vehicles. So this is a picture of, and sometimes it was actually worse than this. It didn't occur to me to try to capture just how many vehicles were out there trying to capture these photos. This was not all us. We had two vehicles, I guess this one and the one behind it. And all the other vehicles are with other groups of people. And there could be at any given time dozens of vehicles out, maybe even hundreds of vehicles out, looking for these animals. And they communicate with each other. There's great cooperation between drivers to go find the interesting animal. Where are they at? And they talk to each other, and then they drive to those locations, and they know the parks very well. And as you can see in this photo, we are in one vehicle. I'm taking the photo of this elephant, and then, or somebody took the photo. And then right behind is another vehicle with us. And so we've surrounded this elephant, and I'll submit to you that this is not a low impact behavior. It's very intrusive onto the animals themselves. And not surprisingly, the elephants tend to walk away or run away. So we have to keep driving and re-chasing them down to keep getting our photo opportunities to take these pictures. Oh, I didn't realize that one was video. So here we are next to two lions. They had been mating, I think. There was a circle of cars around them. So anywhere I would have taken a video or picture from, there would have been people. I think there's a rule, I don't remember the distance, maybe it depends on where you're at, of 30 meters. We get much closer than 30 meters. So the rules aren't really followed, as you can see. So it's intrusive to animals. And then more than that, it's not a very natural experience. As a biologist, as a person who enjoys being outside, I have always dreamed of seeing any wildlife, traveling and doing these things, but I never really dreamed of it with a car in the background. It's just not a very natural experience. And then, of course, the vehicles that we're in are gas guzzlers. So this is not a very environmentally friendly thing to do. You get a sense for how many cars there can be in an area. So this has other downsides. The vehicles themselves damage soils and plants. As Mukila said, the grassland and shrubland, or grassland, has been shifting towards shrubland. And there's probably several reasons for that. One of them is disturbance. So when you disturb a grassland, what comes up after that is not necessarily going to be grass. They don't stay on roads necessarily. If the animals aren't on a road, we often will, it depends on what park you're in, you'll often leave the road and just drive around anywhere to get to the animal. I didn't see any roadkill, but I heard of some. It likely kills a lot of small animals. We saw a tortoise. I didn't get a photo of that, but we didn't run over that tortoise. It was sitting there happy as can be. But I imagine as we drive around, we do crush things in this. It's hard to imagine we don't. And then there's a question of, as Nellie brought up, who owns the land that we're on? I mean, we're here getting the tour of our lives at the expense of the people who used to live on that land. So they've been removed, and then we come in and get our photo opportunities. So it's complicated, right? Because Spencer and others depend on these tourist dollars so that they can make a living. There's an infusion of cash. There's a lot of poverty in Kenya, and this gives people an opportunity to earn a living. But it comes at a cost. And so as we evaluate how we're going to handle environmental issues, how we're going to handle conservation, I don't have an answer for you about what we should do, but I think that you should be aware of how complicated this is. So here's an article from The Guardian. Thousands of Maasai pastoralists in northern Tanzania have written to the British and US governments since 2022, appealing for help to stop plans to evict them from their ancestral land. So if this is Tanzania, the Maasai, the land is called the Serengeti. It's continuous with the Masai Mara where we were at. You might have heard of the Serengeti. More than 150,000 Maasai people face eviction by the Tanzanian government, due to moves by the UN Cultural Agency, UNESCO, and a safari company to use the land for conservation and commercial hunting. So I think that's a little bit ugly, right? To do that to people. And then there's another issue of how to manage the land. I had another photo that, I don't know what happened to it, it disappeared. We took some pictures of fire on the landscape. And the question is fire good for restoring prairies? And the answer here has been yes. And we've shown that it's very successful. We've done it on our own Harper Prairie. And the common wisdom is that that same approach should work here in the Rift Valley, in the Masai Mara, in the Serengeti. But it turns out that even where they burn, shrubland is still replacing grassland. So those efforts aren't working very well. I'm not sure we know why. Some of the people we talked to say that fire is actually bad for the environment there, that you have to do mechanical removal of shrubs. It doesn't match what our common wisdom here in the West. And so there's work to be done. I don't have an answer for which is right. I just know that we have a lot to learn about managing this landscape. This tourism industry creates conflict. Tanzania was accused by the Kenyan government of setting fires on purpose, not to restore grassland, but to control wildebeest migration for their own tourist side. Like if we keep so people go there to see the wildebeest migration. We missed it because of these fires, apparently. So we were just out about a week or two from seeing this. The Kenyan government accused Tanzania of setting the fires on purpose to kind of stall the wildebeest, and the Tanzanian government rejected that, saying, no, it's better for the grassland, and it didn't stop them. The reason that they stayed is because of better rainfall, more rainfall than usual. I don't know what the answer to that is, but the tourism industry creates cultural conflict. And then I'll wrap up with, you can't have sustainable ecosystem management without the full engagement of the local community, to piggyback off what Nellie was saying in the last few slides. So this book, we actually met one of the authors, and he gave a presentation to us talking about some of the issues. We don't have time to go into all of those right now, but it's really complicated. Some of our money, if we donate to the wildlife conservation funds that are out there, goes to governments to protect these lands. And that's usually at the exclusion of the people that used to live there. They're removed from the land, they're shot if they go onto the land, they're considered poachers, even if their family history for 1,000 or 5,000 years have been hunting on that land there was no endangered elephants or endangered rhino or endangered lion issues until they were colonized, right? So they lived on this land very well before we, the West, got there. And so they wrote a book about these issues to bring them to light. And I want you to consider that we need to hold whoever we donate our money to, we need to hold them accountable. We should still donate. I think conservation is still important. It's worthwhile. The tourism industry might still be the way to go. I'm not sure. But regardless, we have to do it in a way that protects the local people. And in my second point here, I'll go through the book. Conservation practices alienate indigenous peoples from conservation efforts. They create or perpetuate poverty of local communities, which is in itself immoral to do that, to spend our money to do that. But moreover, if you're not moved by that argument, the poverty itself exacerbates environmental problems because it forces people who don't have the means to feed their family into things like poaching. It forces people into unsustainable farming or grazing practices. So I don't know what the answer is, but I know that the answer has to include people, and it has to include us and an awareness with us about these issues so that our money and our votes, our policies here affect people there too. And I'll end with that. Yeah. I just time.
No, okay, we're skipping this. No? I guess we can end on some highlights, some photos that I took, things that we kind of took from the trip and enjoyed about the trip. So just three main highlights for me were just meeting people and making connections with people, long-lasting connections. I have like the emails or the WhatsApp. I'm connected with social media with some of the students that we met at a college campus. I met the CEO of a huge auto company. And then, of course, with our driver and our tour guide, we had a really close relationship with him and with the families of some of the organizers of the trip. The food was amazing, so I took a picture of quite a few different plates that I took, and it was cool to kind of compare. So like the black side of my family makes the dish called collard greens, and to be able to compare that to the collard greens that we ate in Kenya, they're pretty similar, but there's a couple differences in ingredients that was cool to learn about, and I might implement into my like family dishes. And then also the sites. So I like to go on hikes in general, and so to go on hikes and to see all these really cool sites in Kenya that I feel like I would have not had the opportunity to do otherwise if I didn't go on this trip. So if you ever have the opportunity to travel, to study abroad, there's a lot that you can gain, including making connections with people, trying new foods that you incorporate into your own kitchen, and also just taking some cool pictures in general. Any other highlights from other people?
I'm going to echo what Bethany said. So
This one?
meeting people there was just amazing. Actually, in the center, if any of you are going to take my Bio 116 class next semester, that's the guy by the name of Marciano. He is a biology professor in Tharaka-Nithi in Kenya. And we're going to have our students work together on a project next semester. So it was great to be able to meet people that we could collaborate with. One of the things we didn't get to talk about, we were there for 6 weeks, right? So conservation was one focus, but there were a lot of things to focus on. Up here at the top, we visited it was a youth-driven movement called Swahili Hub. So basically run by a bunch of 20-year-olds, and it was a kind of economic hub in the Mombasa area. So these sorry, I know you guys are going to say kids, though. These kids are running this organization, which helped to drive some business for them. They provide training for the students to kind of build small businesses in the area and earn an income. If you have the chance, you can check them out on Instagram. We happened to attend their kind of Shark Tank like pitch session where folks were pitching their ideas to investors to get their business off the ground. So that was really cool to see. As Bethany mentioned, the landscapes, really, really beautiful areas, diverse areas. I know we've shown you a lot of pictures, but we couldn't even capture all the diversity in all the pictures. Even just visiting some local communities. So down here, we actually went to a local community. It took us like a whole day to drive there. It was like 12 hours of driving on the edge of Uganda, very close to the Rwandan border. But it was a community that makes their livelihoods through beekeeping. And they were wonderful. We saw different beekeeping methods, and they were just so warm and welcoming. So again, I will echo Bethany, if you have a chance to study abroad, and actually we have a study abroad program in Kenya going on in the spring semester, I would definitely suggest you take that.
All right. Well, for me, it was the big thing was just an opportunity to share a bit about where I come from with my colleagues. So it was a deep honor being from Kenya to be able to take my colleagues there, and also in Kenya also get to meet organizations and people that I had not had a chance to work with or get to know. And there, as you heard earlier, many of the people that we got to meet there are in contact with us and are looking for this, to have long-term relationships with us. So yes, there will be a study abroad program to Kenya next year, and then hopefully we'll continue to do more. So if you're interested, Professor Khalil can show you how to register. And also, Angelica is right there. Also, you can see her too. So
and I'll make a pitch for it, and there it comes. So Kenya, Uganda have so much more to offer than the game drives and the pictures of elephants. Bethany pointed out the food. It's amazing, the culture, the people are so warm and full of love. It was probably my favorite part to experience the music, the dance. So we had to dance constantly. And it wasn't, that's the wrong word, we got to. It was really fun, it was amazing. The cultural difference that strikes me the most is that when the music comes on, people there are ready to just enjoy life for the moment. There's no inhibition. And here, when the music comes on, for so many of us, it's just kind of sitting, right? And even when we started playing the music this morning, the intro music, none of us were up and dancing, but if we were playing that in Kenya, I think that there would have been a lot more dancing, including us, we would have been dancing. And I just love that. It was so much fun. And Ndere is a dance group, a cultural group in Uganda, and we spent several days with them and got to see several performances. And they were the music was so wonderful, the dancing was so wonderful. They had drums, and the power of the drums just washed over me, and I was lost in the moment. We also got a history of African music and how it's influenced music around the world. And they will be here, or at least there's a hope that they will be here this spring, at least some of the dancers, to make music and share that with us. And I hope you can all go to that.
Thank you very much. So we will be here, so you come and say hello.